I'm going to be a little controversial. I don't necessarily think the gap is data when it comes to AI. And someone asks a question about the current strategy, and they get an answer that's partially informed by things that were 25 years ago. Sure, that might be correct. So it may be accurate data, but it's no longer relevant data. You can evaluate the quality of a fact because you can test it against rules or a rubric. Beliefs are different. Don't sponsor data initiatives as a data initiative.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for listening to another episode of Data Innovators and Builders. Today, I'm speaking with Justin Heller. Justin is the former SVP and Chief Data Officer at Synchrony Financial. Justin, thanks for chatting with me today.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, Justin. So let's start with a little bit of a background about yourself.
Sure thing. So, as you mentioned, I'm the former Chief Data Officer at Synchrony. I was Synchrony's Chief Data Officer for nearly 11 years. I was brought in after Synchrony had separated from GE Capital Corp. For those that are not familiar with Synchrony, it's the largest provider of private label credit cards. And I had the pleasure of working there both by establishing the data management program and bringing it through to a fairly high level of data management maturity to both protect the organization, mitigating risks, and also to help enable and drive growth.
Maybe let's get into the data management practices and maybe give us some context about, in your experience, what are some of the very foundational things that you would say are good decisions that help chief data officers or data teams deliver good outcomes over time? And you've seen that evolution from analytics all the way to AI, right?
Yeah. I think first of all the mindset is really critical. Data management is not a project. It's a set of processes. And these processes have to exist to enable other business processes to be successful. So, one of the first things that I think is really critical early on is that you're not establishing a program with the goal of bringing in tools. And you're not establishing a police state where you are preventing people from doing certain things, right? At the end of the day, data management is a set of processes that help instill trust in data. It's supposed to help define who has accountability for it, not at a system layer, but just based on the type of data it is. It's to help build a degree of what I call data democratization, which is unlocking the power of data by empowering your workforce to be self-sufficient. It helps to instill a risk discipline so that processes understand the risks that they're facing in using data. And so these capabilities, as you ask, we're very lucky. We can look at industry frameworks. There's a really long-living industry group called the EDM Council. It's been around for over, I believe, 30 years, that has created an industry framework around capabilities that not only an organization should have but must have because of certain regulatory mandates, but it's not the only thing. It's some of these are capabilities that you just need to grow a business. And so I always found it very helpful in designing the program anchored on an industry framework or multiple industry frameworks to establish a common language that everyone could understand. It also helps that it's not this notion of the CDO invented it, right? When you invent something, someone can challenge it and prove you wrong. But if it's an industry framework that many have adopted, then it's about effective implementation and not justification over the framework itself. And I think being able to translate those types of frameworks into what are the different processes and sub-processes that those capabilities support, and who owns those processes, which ones are enterprise-wide, which ones are pushed down into the rest of the organization, and therefore setting up an operating model around accountability for those processes is really critical. And so, I mean, if you follow those frameworks, they all have common things in mind, right? An operating model requires governance and oversight. Managing risk requires governance and oversight. Adoption requires training. To use data effectively requires a degree of acumen and support, right? So there's a data governance facet whose role is to engage, support, and ensure that the organization understands the risks associated with data. Not necessarily the compliance angle, that's a different function that has that. Data quality is a key set of capabilities that help you detect data anomalies, not prevent them, right? It kind of gets back to the role of applications, right? Technology controls prevent bad data from being captured in the software that's being created, right? A drop-down field is really important. Data quality's role is to detect if anomalies have happened. So you need a detective set of capabilities to identify where controls are missing or are failing. Because ideally, if you properly prevent them, there's nothing to detect. So if you're not allowing bad data to come in, you don't have a data quality program. Data quality measures the defects. I think metadata management is an absolutely critical capability that organizations must master. And there are 3 types of metadata, so it's not necessarily one size fits all type of technology solution, but it's the ability to connect business context and terminology with the technical assets and the mnemonics used for objects like a column or a table, but it's got to be relatable back to business concepts. And then operational metadata about all the different events. So it is the role of data management to connect different disciplines together. That rubric of people, process, technology is spot on, and data lives at the intersection of all of it. And so data management, therefore, is a set of processes that help other processes navigate the risks and the enablement that technology brings, right? So there's an element of detective controls there. And then, the scope of the CDO can vary. It can be broader than that, right? Some CDOs also have the engineering side of things. Some even have, and this was the case for me, I did not own engineering, but I did have information lifecycle management, which is records management. So that's the disposal of information at the end of its life cycle. Some CDOs have a remit around, owning customer data or sponsoring and enabling customer data. Sort of gets into the realm of master data management. But I think it also depends if someone's sitting in the first line of defense or second line of defense, right? I sat in the first line of defense. I owned the risk. And so my role was to really help every process that created data be able to properly assess the risks of not only how they're creating data, but how they're consuming it. And I helped them by helping them leverage the capabilities we just talked about.
And I would say one of the top of mind things as you're talking about like enablement is coming with AI use cases, right? And I would say that maybe a year and a half back, everybody was like, yeah, AI will change so much of the enterprise operation, and then people started hitting the data challenges in making that possible. So maybe give us a little bit of a picture into how some of these data practices that you're talking about are actually applying to AI, or maybe where is the gap further to be met to deliver enterprise AI?
Yeah, I'm going to be a little controversial. I don't necessarily think the gap is data when it comes to AI. I think the gap is moving from a use case mindset to a value creation mindset. Okay. But let's strip it down a bit in terms of what people are really trying to do, right? We live in a world of both structured data and unstructured data. Most data management programs scope has been traditionally structured data. And they've done depending upon the level of maturity, have done a good job at being able to define data quality and measure it. Like I said, it's about anomaly detection and then remediation of those anomalies. And in a structured world, that is obtainable. It's complicated, it may take time, but it's obtainable because that's been the traditional focus. Unstructured data is an entirely different realm, which lands in the information lifecycle management or records management discipline, which has not been managed the same way as data management. So there's a mindset shift that organizations have to make. Now, the irony is a lot of information in your unstructured repositories comes from structured repositories as well as your employees, right? So there's an essence where, if we can trust the data in our structured repositories, we should be able to trust the data in our unstructured repositories. The challenge here is not really having the context to be able to make use of it for AI. Like metadata about structured data has been a traditional focus that gives context and meaning. Columns have definitions. Columns are associated with business terminology. It requires that type of discipline around files, unstructured data. So I think that's really where the struggle is. I think people talk about in terms of data quality. I think in terms of trust, there's a fear. One, organizations want to be able to unleash generative AI, and it's important that we focus when we say AI that we're separating things like robotic process automation, which organizations have been doing for both structured and unstructured data for years, with things like the other end of AI, which is generative AI. I think organizations' nirvana is, hey, I want to be able to point Gen AI chat tools to my knowledge bases. And it's a combination of structured and unstructured data. And there's challenges because they may not necessarily have robustly categorized and managed accountability for their files, although in a records management discipline, I think it's a really good discipline to start around that. What I talk about in industry is that in the age of generative AI, ROI has to also be thought of not only as return on investment for those use cases, it's got to shift to value for the enterprise, but also ROI stands for relevance of information. And that's where organizations, I think, need to invest in is that discipline of applying an operating model, probably connected to the records management discipline, that's also aligned to their data management discipline. So you can go from data element, which is structured data, to record category, which gives you the type of unstructured data, so that you have some degree of context for asking questions. And more importantly, since relevance is critical, that organizations should not be over retaining information, and particularly with some of the privacy laws around how long you retain PII and the urgency and around the set of principles for data minimization, that I think it's really important that organizations reduce their risk landscape, not just by deleting data that they shouldn't have from a privacy perspective, but deleting data that's not relevant to power AI. Imagine you point a chat interface on SharePoint, for example, and you have all sorts of strategy documents that are 25, 30 years old, 10 years old, whatever that is, and someone asks a question about the current strategy and they get an answer that's partially informed by things that were 25 years ago. Sure, that might be correct, so it may be accurate data, but it's no longer relevant data. And that's the critical piece when we talk about human in the loop. The ability to ask the relevant question and be able to discern a relevant answer is critical. And so that's where I think a lot of the organizations are struggling. And I think it's like there's a mindset shift. It's not the same type of data quality constructs that we're familiar with in the case of structured repositories.
Yeah.
It's the relevancy based on age, context, and things of that nature, which has never really been a focal point until now.
Yeah, no, I would very much agree, and I've seen that in practice in some use cases as well. For example, looking at use cases where there are leasing documents and they have information in them, and then you have similar information in your database from the leases. And when somebody is asking a question, these are both data sources, which one to trust, and then also in case of unstructured data, people are using citations as a way to say, hey, I have given you the answer. It's from this document, and this document is maybe 10 years old, right? And it's
Right.
not relevant.
Right. Or worse, it's a copy.
Yeah.
It's not the authoritative version. And so, we talk about systems of record and relational systems. but we generally don't have duplicate copies in those relationships, in those relational systems. We might have data that should have been purged because it's in a temporary structure, but very rarely do we have the same record. In fact, referential integrity prevents it. But the moment you're in an unstructured world, you can have multiple copies of the same thing, and it's hard to declare what is the true record, which system of record, which is why I think the records management discipline is probably going to see a resurgence and a shifting in scope from just retention to proper and simplified categorization, labeling, and disposal.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, that's a very interesting point in looking at unstructured data and thinking about how that is properly managed, and something that wasn't an easily queryable system of or source of information before, but yes, it has become so with LLM. So that brings a new set of responsibilities.
Yeah.
Is this
And different controls, right? Because I'm not going to evaluate the quality of a narrative if someone writes a white paper, right? Let's assume it's not even assisted by AI, it's all them. How do you challenge the integrity of it if it's completely a human notion? And that's kind of like the critical piece. Relational databases store facts, and files store facts and beliefs. You can evaluate the quality of a fact because you can test it against rules or a rubric. Beliefs are different. And so that's why I think relevancy is really one of the more important aspects to think of when you think about unstructured data. Oftentimes the record retention stuff says, this document is your living document until it's superseded with another document. Contracts, great example. Contracts get updated, right? Which basically means the old version, even if you've retained it, has been superseded and is no longer the relevant one. Might be still good for historical comparison. So again, it's a mindset shift in the world of data management, and it's sort of a crossover to another discipline with records management.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things you mentioned earlier, Justin, was metadata and different types of metadata and the sort of importance of that. And I think the understanding or benefits of metadata have started to show in AI as well. One thing I want to also note is that in many cases, we feel like documents that exist in the enterprise are also another source of metadata that may give more picture to what a certain attribute means or what data means and so on. So what has been your experience or thought process on that front? Like, how is this metadata field growing and bringing relevance?
Yeah, I think much like relational or structured data, you have business metadata and technical metadata. You have the same thing with files, right? The technical metadata would be the file name, file creation date, file location, file owner, last update date or last access date. And this is where the operational metadata becomes really important, sort of like the information security discipline around monitoring who has access to what, when was something last accessed, really becomes important in terms of determining the relevancy. Just like in structured data, you want to know who last, what were all the structures that are mostly queried, right? So I think you're right. I think it is similar in that you're dealing with both technical metadata and operational metadata, but the business metadata in unstructured world becomes much more challenging because we don't always necessarily understand how to shift and develop context for a file, because files contain multiple types of information. In structured data, it's much simpler. This data element, customer name, cannot belong to multiple types of data. It is one type of data. But a file might have multiple types of data in it, which is why it's important for it to kind of shift into thinking, well, what process created it? That's additional metadata. And why was it created? That context, so that you could categorize it. Hey, is this a tax record? Is this being used to execute or run a business? Is this a compliance record? And being able to first start in a simplified fashion just to get some grounding, and this is where, the use of AI to help with this becomes really important. It's very challenging for humans to categorize hundreds of millions of files, right? It needs the combination where the tools can help to share what it's identified and learn from it. So there's a little bit of machine learning that's needed, but it all starts with data discovery. You have to know what you have. You need to know what data you have. Then you have to know what it means. This is what we're talking about it. And then we have to know how relevant or how good it is. And on top of that, in order to do all that, you need to know where it is. And so it's the same discipline as data management. It's now applying it cross-discipline to files, which is not what most organizations do, but it's one of the things that how I looked at it and how I pursued it. And it really gave us a huge advantage when it came to privacy, because then we could quickly and easily respond to not only where is the PII, but proactive disposal. If you don't retain things that you shouldn't have longer than you're supposed to, you're never in violation of over retaining someone's PII. So it's a necessity, but I think it varies based on the organization in terms of how they think about it and whether or not they need to mobilize it. I think projects like Crown Jewels programs become really important, critical assets. And again, it's not so much the critical asset as the file. The critical asset is the process and the systems that support the process and the information and data that's used to power that process. And you have to discern which processes are the most critical in organization. That's where I would start in these journeys. I wouldn't try to do everything. Not everything has the same degree of relevancy. Start with the most critical assets.
Yeah, I mean, and talking about relevancy, I would say that one of the things that is much talked about right now is the context layer. Unlike a human using data where you have that context, you can say, hey, this document is old, or this is not relevant, or I can discern between, two different sets of data coming from two different places and as to what's the right one to use. When it comes to an AI agent, the agent doesn't have that knowledge, and that the context layer becomes the source of that information. What does data mean? What relevance does it have? And what quality does it have, and so on. So, what's your thought on companies starting to build these context layers around? Do you think that's just an evolution of metadata, or is this something to be thought about fresh and different?
No, I think it's an evolution of metadata. We talk about semantic layers, but at the end of the day, it's still data, and it's data about data. I think what's important though is how is that metadata curated? Where does it come from? Is it self-documenting vis-a-vis discovery, or does it require enrichment from people? And business metadata requires people, right? Because if you take any term, it could have this different meaning in different organizations. And so it's that combination of people adding contextual relevancy and being able to capture that along with all the other types of metadata, the technical and the operational metadata. And this is where I think human in the loop becomes really important. Machines can't necessarily identify uniquely context. The context is framed in the manner in which it was created or used. So humans still have a really critical role. But getting back to your question, to me it's the evolution of metadata, and you're hearing things like semantic layer or context layer, data observability. These are all, in my mind, different ways of saying you need metadata that captures what things are and what they mean and where they are and who created it and what created it and who's using it and how good is it. It's the culmination of all of this coming together as a single layer, which I think is what is perhaps how people are thinking about it now that has been different in the past. I've always thought about it as that you need all of these things together. And so I think companies that have started that mindset are in a much better shape to move faster when it comes to generative AI. But it's something that has to be continuously enriched, has to be automated. So this is even going back to robotic process automation. You can't keep up with the volume and velocity of the metadata unless you've automated it. You know,
Yeah.
it's just impossible. So, and you have to allow yourself that it's not going to be perfect. And then you need what we were talking about before, detective controls that evaluate where you have gaps, because it's impossible to prevent everything, but you have to be able to detect it.
Yeah. No, I think as you said earlier, right, people who build solid foundations, for the operational and analytical use cases are already benefiting from that in AI applications. I think what added
Yeah.
to the mix was the documents and sort of thinking about how to manage unstructured data in a systematic fashion as well.
Mm.
One,
And I think it's
yeah,
all about, once you create that foundation, you're not creating it for the entire enterprise. Creating it to solve a specific business problem first. And then you have MVP, minimum viable product, is really important. But the goal then is the next problem is not to go build another bespoke solution, but to expand the current solution, enrich it, and onboard the next process. And so if the mindset is you have to build something new each time, then you'll never create a foundation. But if you build it and you then onboard other platforms onto it and other capabilities, and you continuously improve and continuously enrich it, you will incrementally get to the foundation. Again, not every business process is ripe for AI, right? So I always think of it in those terms. I think organizations that look at it as like, I have to build something for the entire enterprise, and don't think about, I have to onboard processes and capabilities into that to take advantage of it and deliver value.
so Justin, I was asking you mentioned MVP, and one of the things that's top of mind is building these AI MVPs, doing that quickly, experimenting fast. So I wanted to ask you, like, when we think about data governance and quality and the controls, and this push to move quickly and build use cases, how do you see that sort of, maybe competing with each other from a data perspective? Where,
Don't
yeah.
stand in the way of innovation,
Mm-hmm.
right? If you're experimenting, let it happen. Do a risk assessment. This is where human loop becomes really important, right? I think most organizations are in this exploration, experimentation, and pilot phase. Fine, right? Once the pilots are done, before they move into production, there should be an assessment that includes data. Are we happy with the outcomes? Do we trust the data? What risks surfaced? What problems arose? And then address the problems that arise. And if the problems don't arise, then don't stand in the way of the business, right? But assessment is critical, right? So that's number one. So if an organization is not assessing before they roll into production, then they're absorbing risks that may eventually be greater than their risk appetites. I think the challenge, though, isn't the pilots or the experimentation. It's the ability for these things to be deployed enterprise-wide, where an organization has the ability to answer what value they're getting from their AI investments. So I don't think it's a data governance issue. I think it is an AI value creation issue. And there's a separate operating model that's needed. Like I said before, data ends up being an enabler or could be an impediment, just like infrastructure is an enabler or could be an impediment, right? You could do a pilot and find yourself not having ample compute or not enough tokens, or you're running out of the tokens that you have and you're going to exceed the budget because the particular use case compute needs are greater than what you've allowed for. Same thing with data, right? Most times data is not an issue. It's usually that the data that you have is not the right data for the business problem or the use case that you're exploring. You're doing something new. So I would really say, listen, to establish your POCs around AI, are we fundamentally doing something that we haven't done before, or is this a way of automating an existing process on the existing data it's using? If it's automating a process and making it more robust, better, scalable, so it can absorb inflationary costs, and it's running off of the data that it's already running on, then the risk hasn't changed and you don't have to do anything special. You still have to have controls around data quality, but you're going to need those anyway. AI is not driving it. Just like if you're using it on-prem or in the cloud, the environment hasn't changed the nature of the risk. You should have those same controls in place ahead of time. I would give pause if there isn't a baseline to say, yeah, this is a record, this is a repository, we know who owns it. If those things aren't defined, I would answer those first. That's how I look at it. I wouldn't bog down a process with data governance or data quality unless there is a known issue or an issue that's discovered. I think it really has to do with how far do you go once you've completed the pilot, and how much you want the business to be reliant upon that solution. Just like innovation on any technology, you have to have the right assessments of risk and the right controls, the right process, and the right value creation system in place.
Okay. No, I think that's great advice for those who are building AI use cases, and of course, want to keep the governance, but it applies to when you go to production and you do want to have the sandboxes and the controls or the
Right.
simplicity to at least try and move innovation, so not get in the way of innovation, as you said.
Yes, government should not impede progress. Governance should help protect things from going off the rails.
So, Justin, this has been a great conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time. You've been an exceptional CDO, one that has, of course, had a long tenure, but also you own data engineering as part of that, right? That's not what.
Well,
CDOs
actually, no,
often-
I did not own data engineering.
Okay. Oh, I thought you owned engineering.
No, I did not own.
Okay.
And I had accountability for it, but I did not directly manage it.
Okay.
CDO, you have accountability for many things that you may not even directly manage. So,
Any words of advice for data leaders who want to become CDOs, or maybe who are in that seat today?
yeah, I would say don't sponsor data initiatives as a data initiative. Seek to help other initiatives remove impediments with data management capabilities. Right? Data is not a project. Right? And I think those that have a project mindset or capability mindset may struggle more than those that look at it as, I'm here to help other people achieve their goals.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a great way to wrap up, because data is indeed the means to the end. We're all here to make some business outcomes happen and be successful. I think it's an important role to play as enterprise try to become AI first as well. So,
Great.
Justin, thank you so much for taking the time today. I really appreciate you sharing your insights.
My pleasure. Thanks very much for having me.